Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for tuning in to the Owl's Nest. Today, we break down the Countdown Cup finals and what that means for the postseason. That's coming up today on the Owl's Nest. Welcome back to our regulars, and hello to any new viewers. If this is your first time visiting the Owl's Nest, make sure you hit the subscribe button and like the video, turn on that bell for notifications, and leave us some comments about how you like the show as well. So the final tournament of the season, the Countdown Cup, is done with and over, and while we do have a few more weeks before we enter into the postseason, we wanted to take a minute to talk about what it was that we saw during the Countdown Cup and how that could end up playing out in the postseason. So we're going to start with the APAC region, which I have to say I'm both a little bit surprised, but really not all that surprised. Of course, the Shanghai Dragons once again returning to their form, their dominance here in the space, and I mean, really, that's what it comes down to, the Shanghai Dragons dominant. So before we get to that, the first thing that I want to ask you, Jake, is where'd the Guangzhou Charge go?
Well, that, I think, is probably the biggest surprise of the whole region in the Countdown Cup, is that the Charge were eliminated by New York first round. And, you know, I think after that showing out of New York, I expected, wow, they might, you know, really put up a fight against the Dragons. But, you know, even they went down pretty easy. So Dragons ended up, not losing a map the entire tournament? Which is pretty ridiculous, to be fair, like playing at that level and that type of consistency from the Dragons, right? And even in the past when they've been successful, it has been more of a bumpy road. So, like, one thing I always talk about on broadcast is that, you know, the sort of final playoffs before playoffs, you know, the Countdown Cup is like that. It's that final moment of confidence building of showing, you know, who's the most dominant team going into those ultimate playoffs. And you know, you literally could not be more dominant than the Shanghai Dragons were. Like, the fact that they stomped through not only New York in the semis, but also Hangzhou Spark 4-0 in the grand finals. And you know, it wasn't just one composition, right? They beat Spark on the dive mirror. They beat Spark playing the Orisa comp in a mirror. Then they beat Spark, you know, not even mirror matching. They're playing dive into Spark's Orisa comp. And there was a lot of swapping going on from the Dragons, but I mean, what's really impressive about this team is that it didn't seem to matter what sort of strategy they played. It wasn't a question of strength of map or meta. It was just how good they were as a team and in all the strategies in the current meta. So, you know, looking ahead to the you know, final playoffs, it's just a question of, can anyone stand up to this team? I still think, though, the Charge, they could be that X factor. Maybe they just had a rough Countdown Cup, not performing to their own expectations. Like, they could definitely still be that team to potentially upset the Shanghai Dragons, as they did previously in the Summer Showdown.
Well, and that was going to be my question, too, because I think that in some of the previous tournaments, obviously, yes, the Shanghai Dragons have been phenomenal. A lot of the teams in the APAC region have all sort of been up to par with each other. But I think in the past, we've also seen, you know, when we try to compare, let's say, you know, the Dragons to what we see out of the Shock, is that the Dragons do still sometimes have, you know, some gaps in their armor. So do you think that this past weekend, was this just a matter of the Shanghai Dragons really stepping it up? Or do you think that maybe some of these other teams, like the Charge or like the New York Excelsior, maybe just had a little bit of a down week?
Well, I think the Charge are that one team that, like, has, you know, historically beaten the Dragons in the super clutch match, right? Like, the Dragons have lost other matches, but those weren't playoff matches. Those weren't extremely high priority matches that, you know for sure we're prepared for. Like, it's possible when, you know, Chengdu gets that upset, it's a little bit more on the vein of Dragons just not being prepared for their style, not being able to anticipate what they're going to do. However, when you're winning playoff matches in this dominant fashion, that excuse, it kind of goes out the window, because, like, these teams all should be prepared for these matches. They should all have an expectation about their opponents, especially the first round opponents. So I think for the Charge to go down to New York, and then for New York to be destroyed by the Dragons, I don't necessarily believe in the transitive property, you know, as it relates to Overwatch, right? That just because Team A beats Team B, Team C beats Team A, that Team C is actually the best team. Like, you know, it's still possible for the matchup element to matter a lot. I think it's possible also for the Charge that they were a little bit more comfortable in the more perma double shield meta, and now that there's a lot of swapping back and forth between dive styles with Winston and Zarya especially, and the double shield comp, that that sort of adjustment was less comfortable then for the Charge. So the worry, though, going into the final playoffs is I think we're likely going to see pretty much the same meta, right? Like with double shield seeing some playtime, with dive seeing playtime on other maps, and I think that could be a wrench in the works for the Charge if they haven't shown that they can be successful in that sort of diverse meta where you need to be ready for a lot of different strategies. That could certainly be an Achilles heel for them. And whereas the Dragons, exactly the opposite, right? They proved that that's no problem for them. In fact, that's where they look the most comfortable.
Well, of course, that's what it always comes down to. The champions are able to play under various styles and various metas, and I have to say that where we are right now is a really, really good place, both in APAC and in NA. A very diverse style of meta compositions coming out. So let's jump over to NA here and talk a little bit about that. Now, obviously, the earlier stages, kind of, going up to the finals, we saw a lot of 3-0s, with the exception of Dallas and Washington, Toronto and the Gladiators. But it came down, I think, to the final few that we thought that it would. The Shock, the Eternal, the Mayhem, and the Fusion, of course. So why don't we start with the Shock side, between the Shock and the Mayhem. What did you expect here? Obviously, the Shock taking it 3-1. Probably the safer bet, but what did you see out of the Mayhem? Anything that you liked?
Well, I think they definitely, had some good moments there, not even just in the map that they won, but throughout the series, putting up a good fight for sure, making it interesting with the Shock. But it did feel that throughout, there was a lot of not so close maps, right? Like places where the Shock, obviously the Mayhem, they're not just completely falling over, but they're putting up a fight. However, Shock, they're just in a commanding lead when they finish the map. Like it wasn't that final fight overtime, barely did it margin. In the most part, it was a little bit more of a clean finish from the Shock. And I think what that shows is really that the Mayhem, they are a strong team, that they can even step up to the Shock, that they can even take maps off them. They are, I think, properly considered as one of the top teams in NA. However, there's still a difference between the top echelon and the very best of the best right now.
Which I think we also saw that in the matchup against the Philadelphia Fusion and the Paris Eternal. I have to say, look, going into this match, I thought that this was probably going to be one of the closest ones of the entire tournament. With Genji still being favored and with Sparkle coming into the game there, I did not expect him to be shut down as hard as he was by Alarm. That's like the only memories that I can even currently recall right here, is just constantly those sleep darts. Not to mention the ones that he got onto, who was playing Sombra? Xe was on Sombra?
Yeah.
What was it that you saw in this match here, and what really set Fusion apart from the Eternal to take that win?
I mean, you definitely took the words right out of my mouth. That Alarm actually went God mode in this match, and there's a reason he's being considered as one of the best players in the league right now, despite this being his rookie season. I mean, he's the person I predicted at the beginning of the season would be the Rookie of the Year, and I think that prediction is looking pretty good right about now, considering the incredible game impact he has on a role that I think is very nuanced, right? The nature of flex support, it has that incredible high skill component of just, hitting these ridiculous shots and being incredibly consistent at the fundamentals of the game. But at the same time, there's a huge component that's also decision-making, strategy, being in the right place at the right time. So to be a young player who's so dominant at that sort of complex, nuanced role, I think says extremely good things about Alarm's future. That he has not only the fundamental mechanical, raw skill, but also he can hang in the strategic gameplay. He can understand where to be at the right time. There are a couple moments, even looking on to the grand finals of the Countdown Cup, where I think I noticed Alarm particularly making great decisions. And even in maps that they lost, I just felt like a lot of times I'm seeing, wow, that's a great move out of Alarm. I was even watching Smurf's Winston to do a POV review, and I noticed quite a few times that Smurf played it really well. I was explaining, wow, he's doing everything right on Winston, but Alarm anticipated those plays and actually played around them with the great sleep darts and bio-nades to force Smurf to, be a little bit less effective than he might have otherwise been. So Alarm was certainly my sort of MVP for the series if, of course, the Philly Fusion had won. But they didn't ultimately, right? That was a tough match for sure for the Philly Fusion.
Yeah, so speaking of the final match, then of course, San Francisco Shock, the Philadelphia Fusion, 4-2 as the final score there. You had just mentioned too when we were talking about the Mayhem out there, even when you look at the top echelon, the top 4 or 5 teams, there's still such a big difference, even between the few that are at the top. How close do you think the gap is between the Fusion and the San Francisco Shock?
I do think it's pretty tight. However, I think this Countdown Cup has really solidified my position that the Shock, they're the best team in North America right now. And maybe a little bit comfortably. I wouldn't say dominantly, I wouldn't say decisively, but I would say comfortably. I think they can expect to win most of the time they play. I think if you look back to the Summer Showdown, my analysis of that match where Shock fell to the Paris Eternal was that essentially Shock, they weren't ready to adapt to the Genji style that had just only recently grown in popularity. My look at that match was that Striker was still having ridiculous games on Tracer. It's just that Tracer style was a little bit outdated. Rascal didn't seem quite as prepared to play the Genji as Paris Eternal did with Sparkle. I think it's actually less on Rascal and more on the overall teams as a whole, where Paris just had a way better command of how to enable Genji, how to succeed with Genji. However, I think that has just completely changed, right? Like, Shock noticed that weakness, they saw the same thing, and they completely flipped the script. Now Rascal looks incredibly sharp on the Genji. And the reality is that he always has been, but it's just a matter of the team being ready for that style, understanding how do you play around this DPS hero, how do you enable him successfully, which when Genji's in the meta, that's critical. Like, your whole team needs to understand how to enable this hero. Just due to the nature of dash resets, you snowball, right? So the first kill being enabled by your teammates turns into a second kill, turns into a third kill, turns into a team wipe, right? So if your team isn't 100% prepared on that enabling factor, it's going to matter a lot more than if you're playing a hero like Tracer or Sombra. That's just frankly a little bit more straightforward to combo with, not as critical that they receive all the team's resources. So I think the Shock just patched that weakness, which is incredibly impressive to me for their long-term future, that, weakness appears, instantly solved by the time we see them next.
So taking a look into the future then, and sort of final thoughts for this episode of the Owl's Nest, looking at how the Shock performed and looking at how the Shanghai Dragons performed, because I think that's the matchup that everybody wants to see in the finals. Who do you give the edge to?
I think I'll continue betting on the San Francisco Shock until the day I die, or maybe until half their players retire or something. Because this roster, to me, looks pretty incredible. I do think it's not... I think it's impossible to make like a fair comparison right now between NA and the APAC region, and that's why we need to do these final playoffs, need to see, who really plays the best, who really wins, in those final matches. There's no way to predict those outcomes before they really come to fruition. I think what's more interesting, though, coming into the final elements of playoffs is, can one of the regions actually dominate, right? Like, can the second qualifier from a region beat the top seed from the other region? That, I think, is like the more exciting, interesting question, because an upset like that would completely stun people, I think. And I think maybe it'd be less surprising in a way if it came from the APAC side that they were dominant, because I think that region has looked stronger on average. However, I think that average might be misleading, because it's not about the average, right? It's about the teams at the top. So the question of who's better at the very top, I think, is too hard to answer right now. And that's why I think those playoffs are like, I don't know who to predict. Like, this is like, normally I predict Shock, and I'm like, okay, I'm pretty confident this is the best decision. But now I'm predicting Shock, like, this is what I usually do. So let's just keep it rolling, I guess. And I like a lot of the players. I'm definitely biased. I'm happy to see them succeed. So that'll be my prediction for the finals. But I'm far from confident in it, and I'm just excited to see how it all breaks down.
All right, well, that's going to be all the time that we have for today. Thank you for watching the Owl's Nest, and before you go, make sure you click that bell to subscribe to our channel and get all the notifications on the latest videos, and keep an eye out for our MVP discussion coming later this weekend. If you've ever been to a Ren Fair or Comic-Con, or you've binged every Star Trek season, check out Checkpoint AFK, where we discuss everything in gaming pop culture while you're away from your keyboard. Available here on our YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Also, make sure you're following Jake over at JakeOW on Twitter and Jake_OW on Twitch and YouTube. And as always, stay on that payload.